G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. This has been taken from a commentary by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries, and I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming. So we're into session 4 of the book of Isaiah. We finished off last session with the call of Isaiah. He saw the Lord high and sitting up, high and lifted up. His train filled the temple. The seraphim were surrounding him, surrounding the throne, crying, "Holy, holy, holy." Isaiah's response when he saw this was, he said, "I'm a dead man." He said, "I'm a dead man." He saw his own sinful state in light of the holy God, and not only that, because he thought he saw the holy God himself, and so he figured, well, nobody sees him and lives, so he thought, "I'm a dead man." And then what we saw was an angel took a burning coal from off the altar, and he touched his lips with it, and thus taking away his iniquity, and his sins were now atoned for. The call was made from the throne as to who would go for us, who would go for the triunity of God. And Isaiah responded in submission, "I'll go, here I am, send me, I'll go." He's told to go to a people who will be unable to understand what he has to say. And he's told to make their heart fat without feeling to any work of God's grace, make their ears heavy so that they're unable to listen, shut their eyes so that they do not have the ability to see correctly. And the results of all of this would be spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness, and spiritual non-understanding. So Isaiah was called to go and have an unsuccessful ministry. Now, we see the judgment upon the nation. We see the depopulation of the land in chapter 6, verse 11 to 12. Then said I, "Lord, how long?" He answered, "Until cities be waste without inhabitant, and houses without man, and the land become utterly useless," utterly waste. "Jehovah have removed men far away, and the forsaken places be many in the midst of the land." So you just got to picture yourself in this situation. God presents a ministry and you gladly volunteer for it. God then tells you that your ministry will end in failure. No one will listen to you. No one will repent. You'll not have a successful ministry at all. You'll not be able to write any prayer letters home reporting great converts, because it's not going to happen. Isaiah's natural response was, "Lord, how long? How long must I continue to do this for a people who will be unresponsive?" That's basically what he's asking. And the answer is given here in the second part of verse 11. He answered, "Until cities be waste without inhabitant, and houses without man, and the land become utterly waste. And Jehovah have removed men far away, and the forsaken places be many in the midst of the land." So the answer is that Isaiah must minister to this people until the land is totally depopulated. Isaiah described in verses 11 to 12 a wave of judgment that will ultimately be fulfilled in AD 70. That's the significance of verse 1. It was the year that King Uzziah died. The prophecy of chapter 6 would be fulfilled by the Roman Empire. The year that King Uzziah died, Rome was established on the banks of the Tiber River. In the year that Isaiah was called to be a prophet, God established a city in Italy which would ultimately grow into an empire and become the power that would be used to fulfill this prophecy. We see the return of the remnant in verse 13. "And if there be yet a tenth in it, it also shall in turn be eaten up as a terebinth and as an oak, whose stock remains when they are felled. So the holy seed is the stock thereof." So verse 13 is a point that Isaiah will develop later on in detail, and that is the return of the remnant. While verses 11 to 12 describe a first wave of judgment to be fulfilled in AD 70, verse 13 describes a second wave of judgments. A portion of the Jews will return from this dispersion of verses 11 to 12. However, they too will be eaten up with judgment. From other prophetic passages, we know that the present state of Israel began to be fulfilled in 1948 when Israel was re-established as a nation. The present state will be eaten up by the judgment of the Great Tribulation. But after the second wave of judgments, the Great Tribulation itself, the remnant will be like the stump or the stock of a great tree. However, this stump is going to be capable of sprouting life again. After the second wave of judgments, the stump that remains will begin to grow to life again. The holy seed will regrow into a tree, and this tree will be the Messianic kingdom. Zechariah chapter 13 verses 8 to 9 shows that 1/3 of the Jewish population will survive the tribulation and will enter the Messianic kingdom. The correlation between Zechariah's 1/3 and Isaiah's 1/10 in verse 13 is that Zechariah is dealing with the worldwide Jewish population, while Isaiah is speaking about the Jewish population in the land of Israel. In other words, although it appears as if Israel has been completely depopulated, it will once again be inhabited by the holy seed, meaning the righteous people of Israel. Now we come to chapter 7, and we're going to go from chapter 7 verse 1 down to chapter 12 verse 6, and this is called the book of Emmanuel. This is the fifth major segment of the prophet, is the book of Emmanuel. It's called the book of Emmanuel because the name Emmanuel will crop up 3 times in this section. At this point, King Ahaz, he was the king of Judah, and of the 4 Judean kings under which Isaiah prophesied, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, Ahaz was the wickedest one. He was uniquely wicked because he tried to be syncretistic and combine the worship of the high places, the golden calf, the worship of Baal, and the worship of Molech. This was a time when the Assyrian Empire was beginning to rise and gain power, and the surrounding smaller kingdoms began to notice the threat. Yet none of them by themselves could do anything about the Assyrian threat. So 2 of the smaller kingdoms nearest the Assyrian Empire were Syria and Israel. Syria's capital was Damascus. Israel's capital was Samaria. So Syria and Israel combined in an attempt to destroy the Assyrian threat. However, even with that combination, they realized that they were not strong enough to destroy the Assyrians. They wanted Judah, with its capital of Jerusalem, to join with them. Nevertheless, Judah under King Ahaz refused. So the 2 kingdoms of Syria and Israel decided on a strategy to do away with Ahaz, which if they had stopped at that point, they may have been able to succeed. However, the plan they formulated was not just to do away with Ahaz personally, but also to do away with the house of David and begin a brand new dynasty, the sons of Tabeel. They desired to set up a brand new dynasty upon the Jerusalem throne. So this was not just a threat to Ahaz, it was also a threat to the house of David. What happened in chapters 7 to 12 must be viewed as a threat to the house of David. If they succeeded in destroying the house of David, this would render the Davidic covenant null and void. If they had merely desired to destroy Ahaz, but retain the house of David, that would have been one thing. The alliance desired to place a new dynasty upon the Davidic throne, which should be supportive of an alliance against the Assyrians. The Judean army was very powerful. Uzziah and Jotham had carefully built up the Judean army. So with the help of Judah, the alliance might succeed in destroying the Assyrians. Historical background to these events is found in 2 Kings chapter 16 verses 1 to 9, 2 Kings 16, 1 to 9, and 2 Chronicles 28, 1 to 7, and 16 to 27. 2 Chronicles 28, 1 to 7, and 16 to 27. The book of Emmanuel will be covered in 5 major sections. We're going to have the coming birth of Emmanuel in chapter 7, verses 1 to 25. That's the coming birth. And then the birth of Emmanuel in chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 9, verse 7. Then we're going to see Jehovah's outreached arm in chapter 9 verse 8 to 10, verse 4. We're going to see the judgment of Assyria in chapter 10, verse 5 to 34, and then the reign of Emmanuel in chapter 11, verse 1 to 12, verse 6. Now, this was just a little bit historical background. Now, in Hebrew, the nation of Assyria is called Ashur, A-S-H-U-R, and the country of Syria is called Aram, A-R-A-M. The name Syria was given to this nation by the Greeks, which influenced the English translations. Had the translators of the English Bibles used the Hebrew names, there would be less confusion for the reader. Syria would be Aram, and the Syrians would be Arameans. And these names would be easily distinguishable from Assyria and the Assyrians. We're going to use more or less the terms Aram and Arameans as we go through from chapter 7 to chapter 12, just so we can differentiate between the Syrians and the Assyrians. Okay, see the coming birth of Emmanuel, verses 1 to 25, chapter 7. We see here the threat to the house of David in verses 1 to 2 of chapter 7. And it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told the house of David, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim, and his heart trembled, and the heart of his people, as the trees of the forest tremble with the wind. So here we have three kings in verse 1. Ahaz, who ruled over Judah, southern kingdom from Jerusalem. Rezin, who ruled over Aram or Syria from Damascus. And then Pekah, who ruled over Israel, the northern kingdom from Samaria. In verse 1, we see that there's an initial attempt to do away with Ahaz. The initial attack was by Israel alone against Judah. That's why the term is singular. But verse 1 says, but could not prevail against it. This is a reference to the king of Israel, Pekah. The initial attempt to take Jerusalem failed. The Israelite army and the Syrian, the Aramean armies split. Israel attacked Jerusalem. Syria or Aram attacked the city of Aqaba or Elat. That's still in Judah. The Syrians succeeded in taking Aqaba or Elat and closing off Judah's southern port. However, Israel was unable to take Jerusalem. In verse 2, the armies of Syria and Israel combined now to attack Jerusalem. Remember, the southern kingdom of Judah is ruled by the house of David. Every king must be a descendant of David. Ahaz was the Davidic king at this time. Ephraim is another name for the northern kingdom of Israel. So Aram, Syria arrived to help Israel fulfill the plan to dethrone Ahaz and destroy the Davidic dynasty. When Ahaz and the house of David were told that Israel and Syria have now combined against them, they were deeply shaken. It was told the house of David, Syria's forces are deployed with Ephraim. So Israel's solo attempt had failed to take Jerusalem. Now reinforcements arrive. Any attempt to eliminate the Davidic dynasty went contrary to God's plans. Therefore, Israel and Aram could never have succeeded. Yet because of the lack of faith, the house of David was like a tree shaking in the wind. There's an interplay here between the house of David as a whole and Ahaz in particular. The threat which we see here pertained to the Davidic dynasty as a whole, but the one in charge at this time, the dynastic ruler at this time, was Ahaz, and he shook the most. He was fearful. The trembling that Ahaz and the house of David experienced in verse 2 was a trembling because of the lack of faith and trust in the word of God. And we see we see in passages like 2 Samuel 7, 11 to 17, which we on the screen there, and 1 Chronicles 17, 10 to 15, Psalm 89, 1 to 37. These passages detail for us the content of the Davidic covenant that God made with David. If Ahaz had been willing to trust in the Davidic covenant, there would have been no danger whatsoever of him fearing the conspiracy of the Syrians and the Israelites. Nevertheless, Because of that basic lack of faith, Isaiah characterizes the Davidic house of shaking like the trees by the wind. Now, he's going to bring a message to Ahaz. And we see the prophet's commission in verse 3. Then said Jehovah unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, in the highway of the fuller's field. So Isaiah was now told to go out to meet Ahaz. The prophet was also commanded to bring his son Shear-Jashub, whose name means a remnant shall return. As the wider context will show, there was a good reason for Shear-Jashub to be there. He was going to serve as a sign for King Ahaz. The place of meeting was the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. Now, between the east wall of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives is the valley of Kidron. Jerusalem's main water source, known as the Gihon Springs, was in this valley. More precisely, it was on the road to the fuller's field, where we see, when we get to Isaiah 36 verse 2, a man called Rabshakeh, who was Sennacherib's field commander from Assyria, came there to speak to King Hezekiah. Now, the road to the fuller's field was a place where fabrics were washed and then laid out to dry. Ahaz was going out to prepare for a second siege, so he was checking the water source and the supplies. In verses 4 to 6, we see the plot against the house of David. And unto him, and say unto him, Take heed and be quiet. Fear not, neither let your heart be faint because of these two tales of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and of the son of Remaliah. We'll just read verse 4 here. In 4 statements, Isaiah now attempted to comfort Ahaz. First of all, he says, take heed. So what he's saying is, be on guard. He warned Ahaz against taking any actions which would estrange him from God. Second, be quiet. So he exhorts the king to have a quiet confidence in God. This is something important. Throughout this book of Emmanuel, there will be a constant contrast between the noise and the quiet. Third thing he's told, do not fear. Fourth thing, do not be of faint heart. See, Ahaz's plans were not to align himself with Israel and Syria. He was going to do something else. He was going to make friends with the Assyrians and hire them against the Syrians and Israel. This is the point that Isaiah is making. Isaiah is warning him not to make friends with the noisy Assyrians, but to have a quiet trust in the Lord. So this is a contrast between the quiet and the noise. This contrast between the noisiness and the quietness will be a motif that's going to be carried through Isaiah's writings concerning the remnant of Israel. The remnant motif here is very important, as we're going to see. In verse 4, Isaiah says, the figures Ahaz is fearing, these two kings, are merely two burned out stumps. Now, from God's viewpoint, the two kings of Syria and Israel are merely two ends of a poker that are smoking but will burn no more. They'll smoke for a while, but they'll burn away. They burned for a while when Eilat was taken, which was in southern Jordan, and the northern section of Judah was devastated. But they burned out at Jerusalem when they could not defeat her. Now the burning has ceased. Like two smoking sticks, they'll burn no more. They have done all the damage to Judah that they'll be allowed. They have ravaged Judah, but they will not be allowed to defeat Jerusalem. And in verses 5 to 6, we see the conspiracy. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have purposed evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and vex it. Let us make a breach therein for us, and set up a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. So here is a conspiracy. Steps are, first, let us go up against Judah and vex or trouble it. Aram and Israel, or Syria and Israel, first wanted to invade Judah. Second, let us make a gap in its walls for ourselves. They were planning on tearing the kingdom apart and dividing it among themselves. Third, let us set a king over them, the son of Tabeel. Their third desire was to replace the house of David with the house of Tabeel. Now, Tabeel did set up a dynasty of sorts later, because we see in Ezra chapter 4, verse 7, Ezra 4:7, we read about Tabeel. We read that the descendants of Tabeel, a couple of centuries later, were enemies of Jerusalem. The sons of Tabeel in Ezra's time were anti-Jerusalem. Isaiah likes to play with words. Remember, we spoke at the very first that Isaiah was a master of the Hebrew language. He rewords one vowel pattern and he changes the meaning of this man's name. In Hebrew, Tabeel means God is good. Isaiah changes one vowel and the word Tabeal means good for nothing. Change an E to an A. So in verse 6, one vowel is replaced to change the meaning of his name. The Hebrew alphabet, remember, has no vowel letters. And there were no diacritical marks when Isaiah wrote his book. In verse 7 to 9, we see the judgment of the confederacy. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken in pieces, so that it shall not be a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. He's talking to Ahaz here. So Isaiah pronounces a judgment upon this conspiracy. In verse 7, Isaiah says that the conspiracy is doomed to failure. In verses 8 to 9 is the judgment itself. Verse 8 says, for the head of Syria is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin. The idea here is that all Rezin will ever be is the leader of Syria. He'll not become the head of Jerusalem. As for Ephraim, he says she'll cease to be a people within 65 years. Now, this prophecy has created some confusion. Isaiah's prophecy comes in 735 BC. The northern kingdom ceased to exist in 722, 721 BC. It's only 14 years. So why did Isaiah say 65 years? Why didn't he just say that in 14 years it would come to pass? Did Isaiah think that he'd be dead in 65 years and wouldn't have to answer the prophecy? The answer to these two questions we find in two other passages of Scripture. The first one is 2 Kings chapter 17, 22 to 24. I'll read these for you. 2 Kings 17, 22. And the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They departed not from them, until Jehovah removed Israel out of his sight, as he spake by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and men from Cuthah and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. So we're told here in 2 Kings passage, 2 Kings 17, we're told that there was a shifting of the population. The Jews were removed and Gentiles were brought in to occupy the area of the northern kingdom. 2 Kings does not specifically date this element, nor does it tell us which kings did it. But Ezra 4 verse 2 provides more details. Then they drew near to Zerubbabel and to the heads of fathers' houses and said unto them, let us build with you, for we seek your God, as you do, and we sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up hither. So, the king who destroyed the northern kingdom was the Neo-Assyrian emperor Sargon II. That was around about 760. He ruled from about 762 to 705, somewhere around there. But he never replaced the Jewish population of Israel with Gentiles. This event occurred much later, namely in the year 670 BC, under a king by the name of Esarhaddon. Now, what we see here is that exactly 65 years passed between Isaiah's prophecy of 735 BC and what Esarhaddon did in 670 BC. So there is no discrepancy at all. That's the 65 years that Isaiah gave him. Head of Ephraim is Samaria, verse 9, head of Ephraim is Samaria, head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Now, as for Pekah, the son of Remaliah, he was the king of Israel, and therefore the head of the capital of Samaria. The point here is the same as with Rezin, the king of Damascus. All Pekah was ever going to be was head of Samaria. He'd never become the head of Jerusalem. Now, this was a promise, and it was going to happen regardless of what Ahaz believed or disbelieved. As for Ahaz personally, Isaiah stated in the second part of verse 9, if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Here again is a word play in the Hebrew text. Hebrew text this is just phonetically speaking, im lo ta aminu, ki lo te amenu. So the shift of a vowel pattern that is of importance here is seen in the words aminu, which is believe, and amenu, which is be established. The contrast that Isaiah is making is between believing and being established. If Judah did not hold fast to its God, she would lose her fast hold in the land. That's basically what he's saying. So an English equivalent of what Isaiah was trying to express would be if in God you do not confide, then in power you will not abide. If in God you do not believe, neither blessing will you receive. See, Ahaz trusted in Assyria for his help. If he sought God, if he looked at God, he would not see Pekah and Rezin. He would not see the threats that he thought they were. However, if he looked at Pekah and Rezin, the two kings, he would only see Assyria as his deliverer. God's promise was assured. So it was going to happen. The kings of Aram and Israel would not do any more damage to Judah. In verses 10 to 7, we see the signs of deliverance. Now, in verse 10 to 11, Isaiah offered Ahaz a sign of deliverance. What would it take for Ahaz to trust the promises he had just received? It is important to see, again, the interplay between the house of David as a whole and Ahaz as an individual. In Hebrew, there is a difference between a plural you and a singular you. For instance, the word you in English could mean one or it could mean many. Hebrew doesn't have such a distinction. To properly understand what is happening in Isaiah 7:10 to 17, the distinction between the singular you and the plural you is crucially important, and we're going to see it as we go through here. Another crucial fact is the difference between the law of double fulfillment and double reference, okay? Now, double fulfillment says that one passage of scripture, like we're going to see in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, has a fulfillment one way, and then many years later, it has another fulfillment another way. Sometimes Isaiah 7:14 is looked upon as a double fulfillment. The near view would be a reference to a child being born in Ahaz's day, but the far view is that of a virgin-born child who is the Messiah. Now listen, double fulfillment does not exist. It is not a credible form of interpretation. It just simply does not happen. Double reference says that in a passage of scripture, the first part refers to one event, the second part of a passage refers to a second person and a second event at a different point in time. However, they're blended together in such a way that they may appear to be one person, one event. Many of the prophecies regarding the first and second comings of Christ are examples of double reference. Zechariah 9:9 to 10 is an example of this. Verse 9 deals with the first coming. Verse 10 deals with the second coming. yet they're blended together in such a way that we cannot tell in the text itself that there is a difference of many, many years between the fulfillment of these two verses. Once again, double fulfillment does not exist. In double reference, first part of a passage refers to one event, second part of a passage refers to another event. They're blended together into one picture. What is happening in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 13 to 17 is an example of double reference. Isaiah 7:14 must either refer to a child in Ahaz's day or to the birth of the Messiah. It cannot refer to both. Isaiah 7:13 to 17 can be better explained if it's taken as following the law of double reference rather than the principle of double fulfillment. Verses 13 to 14 refer to the virgin birth of the Messiah only. These verses are addressed to the house of David in general, as can be seen by the usage of plural pronouns in the Hebrew text. Verses 15 to 17 refer to a child in Ahaz's day because the address is to Ahaz alone, as can be seen in the shift to singular pronouns in the Hebrew text. This child is probably Shear-Yashub of verse 3. So the double reference speaks of two persons separated by a period of time. Okay. We see the offer of a sign to Ahaz. And Jehovah spake, this section from 10 to 17 has to do with signs of deliverance for Ahaz. Verse 10 says, And Jehovah spake again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask you a sign of Jehovah your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. Now here in verses 10 to 11, Isaiah offered Ahaz a sign of deliverance. What would it take for Ahaz to trust a promise he had just received? The passage begins in verse 10 with a comment that it was God who was speaking to Ahaz through the prophet Isaiah. Jehovah spake again unto Ahaz. Now, notice the you in verse 11. Ask you a sign. Isaiah is speaking only to Ahaz. It's a singular you as well as a singular your God. In verse 11, the Hebrew word for ask, shall, is in the imperative. It's a command. It's with a command by God. Isaiah is emphatic. It comes from of Jehovah your God. He's commanded to ask of Jehovah your God. Now, even though Ahaz is an unbeliever, Isaiah refers to the Lord as his God, the Lord your God. He's of Jehovah your God. He refers to the Lord as his God because of the covenant relationship. Isaiah offered Ahaz anything that he wanted. Got the hiccup. Hang on a sec. Oh, Isaiah offered Ahaz anything he wanted. He could ask for a sign in heaven or on the earth. Whatever it would take to convince Ahaz that the promise was true, God would perform that sign. He could ask anything that he desired. And now the word sign is also important here. Hebrew word for sign is ot, O-T. It is used a total of 79 times in the entire Bible. Isaiah used it 11 times. Looking up all of the 79 passages, it is used basically three ways. First of all, it's used in the sense of heavenly bodies. The stars are signs of navigation, for instance, in Genesis 1, verse 14. Second, it means token or proof. Now, this meaning does not necessarily require the miraculous. Rather, the sign simply provides a positive proof of a certain truth. Example, Exodus 3:12, for instance. Third, it was also used in the sense of the supernatural and miraculous as seen in Exodus chapter 4, verses 6 to 9. The signs were miracles of sticks turning into snakes and so on. Now, as far as the way the term is used in verse 11, the meaning is now determined by the context. The purpose for the sign in the context was to confirm what the prophet just said and to produce faith in Ahaz. From what we know about Ahaz, that was going to have to take a miracle. We see in verse 12 now the rejection of the offer. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt Jehovah. At this point, Ahaz gets spiritual. I will not tempt the Lord, he says. Now, it does sound spiritual. He's actually appealing to a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, which says that we should not tempt the Lord our God and that we should not put him to the test. So the Israelites were not to put God to the test. They were not to ask for a sign that would guarantee the fulfillment of a prophecy. They were simply to believe the prophecy. Nevertheless, the way that Ahaz is using this is not a valid use. The fallacy in his logic here was that God offered him a sign. He rejected the offer because if the sign actually took place, it would require him to change his pro-Assyrian plans. He would have to stop trusting Assyria and begin trusting God. And for that reason, he piously rejected the offer. The reason he rejected the offer was that he did not want to have to trust God because it'd mean he'd have to change his ways. So now we see in verse 13 to 14, we see a sign now to David, to the house of David. And he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, that you will weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So Isaiah begins to give two specific signs. He gave one sign for one party and another sign for another party. First, notice in verse 13 that he's no longer addressing Ahaz alone, but he's also now addressing the house of David. Second, in the Hebrew, every pronoun in these two verses is no longer in the singular, but in the plural. In verses 10 to 12, the pronouns were in the singular. If we reread these two verses with the pronoun you all, we see here, and he said, Hear you all now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you all to weary men, that you all will weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you all a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He's now addressing the house of David, and there's a switch from the singular to the plural you. Moreover, the sign he is giving is not to Ahaz individually, but it is being given to the house of David corporately. The key question is, how could any miracle which will take place 7 centuries later be of any real comfort to Ahaz? That's the problem, and that's the reason that some people believe in double fulfillment. If you're in trouble and I say to you, do not worry, because 700 years later this will take place. And that doesn't offer very much comfort today. That's the problem in this passage. The problem is better solved by double reference rather than by double fulfillment. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, that you will weary my God also? By Ahaz refusing to ask for a sign, that it is precisely what he was doing. He was testing God's patience with him. He was also testing the patience of the godly in Israel who were looking for their king to trust God. Are you not content with wearying men, with disregarding all my warnings and so wearying me? Must you go further and weary God? This is paraphrasing. Or must you wear out God's patience by rejecting his gracious offers? Notice Isaiah says, my God. In verse 11, Isaiah had called Jehovah your God. But as Ahaz, by rejecting God's offer, had rejected God, he speaks of him now as my God, Isaiah's God. In verse 14, behold the virgin. The word behold is what we call a demonstrative article that can refer to something past, present, or future. Nevertheless, there's a nice point of Hebrew grammar that is worth knowing. If the word behold is used with the Hebrew active participle, It is always future. In addition, what we see here is shall conceive is an active participle. So here, behold is used with the Hebrew active participle, so it refers to something that is still future. A common argument is that they say that Isaiah was referring to someone already pregnant, and the future refers to the birth of a child. Now, however, notice here that what he says is still future. It's not the birth, but the very conception is still future. He's not referring to someone who's pregnant. She's not pregnant yet. Isaiah himself uses the term behold 43 times in this book. In every case, it is future with one exception, and that's chapter 48, verse 7. First of all, one point of evidence was the element of a sign. The purpose was to produce faith in Ahaz, and that would require a miracle. Second, the term behold with the active participle must point to something still future. The event predicted in verse 14 includes both the conception and the birth of a child. Now, the term virgin itself is very, very important. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Three Hebrew words must be distinguished here with this term virgin. Word Alma, and then Naara, and then Bethulah. Naara is generally translated as damsel. It's used to describe virgins and non-virgins. In the case of a virgin, 1 Kings 1:2 is an example. In the case of a non-virgin, Ruth 2 verse 6 is an example. Second, in modern Hebrew, the word Bethulah means virgin. It generally means a single girl without regard to age. In most cases in classical Hebrew, it was used of a virgin. But because the word itself does not always clearly mean virgin, often after the word Bethulah, a descriptive phrase is added to the point that they mean virgin. Genesis 24:16, for instance. And the damsel, Naara, was very fair to look upon, a virgin Bethulah, neither had any man known her. Now, if Bethulah meant strictly virginity, that would have been sufficient, but the word did not always mean so. So the added explanation had to be given. Neither had this Bethulah, this virgin, had known any man. Another example is Judges 21:12. They found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins. The word here is Bethulah. If it always meant strictly virginity, that should have been sufficient. But because it does not, they added that had not known man by lying with them. So these were actual physical virgins. There's an example where it's used of a non-virgin in Joel 1:8. Joel 1:8, lament like a virgin, like a Bethulah, girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. Well, obviously, there was a husband of youth. It means she was married before. So here's someone who laments for her husband. In this case, it's used of a widow who became single through her husband's death. So Bethulah means a single girl of any age. In most cases, it is used of virgins, though the explanation must be attached at times because it is also used of non-virgins. Now, third, in Isaiah 7, the word Alma is used. Basic meaning, young virgin. It never refers to someone who is old. It is never used to refer to a married woman. It always refers to a young woman of marriageable age. The emphasis is that she is a young virgin. There's much evidence that Alma points strictly to the virginity of a young woman. For instance, the cognate studies. There are many Semitic languages besides Hebrew, such as Babylonian, Ugaritic, Arabic, and Phoenician. In every cognate language dealt with so far, the root alm, A-L-M, from which Alma is formed, always means virgin. No one debates that fact. By use of these cognate languages, which are the languages, the Semitic languages, the root always means virgin. So in order to deny that Alma always means virgin, Hebrew must be the one exception to the rule of the cognate languages. But it's not. Besides the cognates, There is a translation of the Septuagint, right? That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament into Greek about 250 BC. At that point, the issue of Jesus hadn't come up yet, obviously not. So when the Greek translators came to Isaiah, when the Jewish translators translating into Greek came to Isaiah 7:14, they used the Greek word parthenos for Alma, which is the Greek word for strict virginity. In the Old Testament, the word is found only in 7 places, and in every Old Testament reference, while some passages are clearly virgins, even the unclear passages at least allow for virginity. In all of these passages, one thing is certain: it never refers to a married woman. In some passages, it is clearly a virgin, but in the unclear passages, it at least allows for it. The 7 passages are Genesis 24:43, speaking of Rebecca, we're told she's a virgin. Exodus 2:8, Miriam, Moses' sister. Psalm 68:25, these are the women of repute worthy to participate in the religious procession. So her virginity was the case in this passage. Song of Solomon 1:3 refers to women who are worthy to be desired. Solomon 6:8 used in contrast to 2 other groups. These groups are queens, concubines, and virgins without number. Now, queens were legal wives. Main function was to produce royal seed and heir apparent. Their task was to produce legitimate children with possibilities for the throne. Concubines were sex experts for the king. Virgins were prospective concubines. So this is the contrast between the 3, which put them into the virgin group. And then we have 6, Proverbs 30:18-9. The virgin is contrasted with the adulteress. And then we have Isaiah 7:14. What is clear here is that it refers to an unmarried woman. The word Alma can never refer to a married woman. Now, since Alma only refers to an unmarried woman, this leaves one with only 2 options. Isaiah 7:14, the term either refers to a virgin conception and birth, or it refers to an illegitimate conception and birth. Now, keep in mind here that God had promised a sign to the house of David. So this second option doesn't make sense. God was going to perform a miracle. That factor only gives 2 options as to what this passage means. Either there's a virgin conception or birth, or there's an illegitimate birth. Only 2 options we have. So who is performing the miracles that are supposed to be a sign for Ahaz? The entire context militates against the second option, the illegitimate option. Illegitimate birth is, anyway, it's not a miracle. It occurs quite often. Second, this is something that God is performing. And if you're going to put God on the illegitimate birth side, you got some more problems facing you. So the whole context of this Isaiah 7:14 and the passage moves towards a virgin birth. And illegitimate birth would not impress Ahaz. Also, there is something that God is performing. Obviously, God would not perform an illegitimate birth. In addition, a virgin getting married and then conceiving is not a sign. The miracle here is that she will conceive while a virgin. That will be the miracle. Conception itself is still future, not present. Okay. Also, the definite article is also important. It does not say, in the Hebrew, it does not say a virgin. It says the virgin. So the rules for the use of the definite article when it refers to something specific are, first of all, well, if it refers to a woman who's already mentioned in the immediate context, we need to go to that woman first. But so far, no woman has been mentioned. Second, from there, we need to then go to the law of previous mention. If some event or figure had become prominent in the minds of the people, so that if you said, hey, you know, there's such and such, everyone knows what you're talking about. For instance, the expression Exodus only means to go out. But if you say the Exodus, it refers to the coming out under Moses from Egypt. We know that. Now, this is what is happening here. It is a law of previous mention because it is the only option we can go to since there is no woman mentioned in the immediate context. There must be a specific woman in the minds of the population where simply the Alma, the virgin, that everyone would know that you're talking about. Where has there ever been such a previous mention? This previous mention is the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15 is the reference. Isaiah is finally explaining the message of Genesis 3:15 because Genesis 3:15 prophesies that the Messiah's seed or genealogy would be reckoned after the woman, which goes contrary to all biblical systems and principles of Jewish law. Now he explains why this is necessary. Messiah will be reckoned after the seed of the woman because no man will be involved. He will be born of a virgin. Something else in verse 14. And you shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, while the English translation implies the future tense, Hebrew indicates what is known as the prophetic perfect tense. It's a literary technique that is used to describe future events that are so certain to happen that they are referred to in the perfect present tense as if they had already happened. When parents name a child, it shows the thinking of the parents. Perhaps it will be true, perhaps it will not be true of the child. However, when God names a child, it shows the character of the one so named. The character of this one will not be true. The character of this one is with us God, Emmanuel. Concerning Emmanuel, there's a certain flow in the context. In chapter 7, Emmanuel will be born. In chapter 9, in chapter 7, Emmanuel will be born. In chapter 9, Emmanuel will be viewed as having been born. In chapter 11 of the book of Emmanuel, Emmanuel is reigning. In Isaiah 7, Ahaz was given a specific promise by the end of verse 9. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. The two kings in the conspiracy against the house of David are doomed to failure. The promise is certain. Regardless of what Ahaz himself may believe or disbelieve concerning it, the promise remains true. Now, this does not guarantee the establishment of Ahaz personally. In order for Ahaz to be personally established, he must exercise faith and trust. There's no threat to the house of David because the promise will remain. In verses 10 to 12, he uses a singular you. He tells Ahaz that whatever he asks, God will perform to prove the truth of his promises to him. Ahaz chooses not to ask for anything, because if what Ahaz asked for came true, it would require a change of his plans. And since he chose no sign, God himself chose a sign for him. In verses 13 to 14, he addresses not Ahaz in particular, but the entire house of David. The pronoun is switched. No longer is it singular, but it is plural, you all. The point of the prophecy is that the house of David can in no way disappear until the birth of a virgin-born son. But of course, that does not solve the problem in the passage, because this sign will not come to pass for 700 years. This sign of the virgin giving birth to the Messiah does not offer any hope or comfort for Ahaz. The next segment in verses 15 through 17, we will see that. Isaiah will refer back to the singular you in that passage. And this is where we shall leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.